This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Because this is landing a day before the U.S. Thanksgiving, it's very possible that some of you are traveling to very difficult family gatherings and meals that you are not looking forward to. I hope that this particular episode will be of comfort to you to recognize that you are not alone. There are many of us out there. And mostly I just want to say that I am thankful for you, the listener. I would not continue the podcast if I didn't know that you were out there listening. And I find a great deal of comfort, support, and mental health from doing these interviews, from sharing these interviews with you, and knowing that they can be of some comfort to you as well. So I'm thankful for you. I thought I'd share a brief secular grace thought for the holiday, and that is that the religious do not own gratitude. Do spend some time cataloging the reasons that you have to be grateful. Number one of which is the relationships in your life with the people who may be difficult to have relationships with. Be thankful for those people as well. Be thankful for the people who are your chosen family, the people who support you, your friends. Be thankful for the people in your life. One of the things that I am thankful for is I have just recently received some help. John at Glen Coyote Studios in Fort Collins has been helping me with the production and editing of this podcast, and I want to give him a huge thank you for all of his work in preparing this episode with my guest, Janice Selbie. You'll, I hope, hear a higher quality and a better rhythm of the conversation. I will note that Janice had a bit of background noise that even a professional such as John was unable to remove, so don't hold that against him. I just want to express my enormous gratitude to John for giving of his time, and I hope that you all benefit from his work. Thanks again, John. On to today's show. My guest today is Janice Selbie. This is the third in my series of mental health professionals discussing religious trauma, religious abuse, and adverse religious experiences. Janice is a registered professional counselor in Canada, and she has what seems to be single-handedly created the Conference on Religious Trauma, which is a conference where leading experts discuss the causes, effects, and recovery related to religious trauma. The Conference on Religious Trauma is now being sponsored by the Secular Therapy Project, which is a division of Recovering from Religion, and by Journey Free, which is Dr. Marlene Winnell's organization. Janice's story is also featured in a compilation book available on Amazon. It's called Daring to Share, Deception to Truth. I'll have links in the show notes so that you can check it out. Janice has kindly given out a discount code for the Conference on Religious Trauma, and that discount code for my listeners is GA036. That's capital G, capital A, 036. And that will get you $60 off a registration to the conference. Janice has an incredible story of her own personal fundamentalism and deconstruction and deconversion, and I want to applaud her for the honesty with which she shares it in this episode. Without further delay, I give you Janice Selbie. Janice Selbie, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Thank you.
Janice, I basically just know you from online. I know that you're putting on the Conference on Religious Trauma. But tell us briefly a little bit about yourself, your qualifications. I see that it's RPC, but I don't know what that means.
Sure, yes. So I am in Canada a registered professional counselor. That's the designation of my governing body. There are different governing bodies across Canada in the different provinces. I'm in British Columbia. So that's the body that oversees me. But the conference has been completely my idea and separate from my governing body. And of course, it's based on my own experience, having been an evangelical fundamentalist for over 40 years, and then breaking free from that and what that experience has been like for me.
Wow. Okay. So yeah, well, let's just jump right in. So I want to hear about, what was it like What kind of faith tradition did you grow up in? What was the particular flavor of fundamentalism?
Yeah, I love that word. Yeah, the flavor. The flavor was heavily Pentecostal, I can tell
Okay.
you.
All right. I have some experience there. So, okay.
Oh, do you? Yes, in Canada, it's the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada, but with a dose of vineyard thrown in. And then when I really went fundamentalist, I went closed Mennonite. So I would refer to myself as a Menocostal.
Okay.
Because I still liked all that great music that the Pentecostals and vineyard groups are known for, but I became extremely conservative in my views. My husband at the time was a pastor, and he had concerns. He didn't grow up religious. He became religious in his very late teens, so his identity had already been formed. I was indoctrinated from the cradle. So my identity didn't have a chance to form outside of my religious indoctrination. And so as I became more and more fundamentalist, he would warn me, said, "Dear, you're drawing your circle smaller and smaller. How small are you going to draw that circle?" And I really didn't want to hear that, but because he was my husband and I had to listen to him, I did, on some level, I did take that in and receive that warning from him.
Okay. So it's interesting you bring that up. My personal experience was about 16. My mom had a dramatic conversion experience and I followed shortly thereafter. But I find that the transition out of religion and fundamentalism specifically was maybe easier for me just because I came to it in the late teens like that. And so it's interesting to hear you say that that was your husband's experience as well.
Yes, and so we are no longer married. We are very good friends. Yeah, we're very good friends. I'm quite fortunate in that regard. And his journey has been his own. He's no longer a pastor, and I don't believe he even would consider himself a member of the faith anymore. But our journeys were very different. When I lost my faith, it was earth-shattering. It was because I didn't have that identity to fall back on. Everything I thought I knew came into question, and it was extremely painful. And of course, we were raising children at the time, and we were struggling in our marriage at the time. So it was loss upon loss, multiple losses. And in fact, after I lost my faith and then I lost my marriage, it was at that point that I went back to school to become a counselor. And then, I just had to do a lot of introspection at that point. When you're preparing to become a counselor, you have to make sure that you have dealt with your with your own issues, right? You don't want to be projecting onto your clients, which doesn't mean I'm 100% without baggage, because nobody is. But it was extremely cathartic and helpful for me. It gave me permission really to explore my own wounds.
Right. So you're telling me you're still human.
I am fully human.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. I understand what you're describing, this compounding loss. So at the same time that you're losing faith in this sense of a very close relationship to a father type of figure or a lover for some people, but this idea of God, whatever, it is very intimate. It's very close. And the loss of that is huge. And then on top of that, having these other family things falling apart at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. And so my identity came into play on many different levels as I lost my faith. So suddenly I was no longer a devout, homeschooling, head covering, fundamentalist Christian woman who had these very solid black and white views. And I had a place in my community. I knew where my place was. So those things were gone. And then I wasn't a wife anymore. And so it's just letting go of thing after thing. And also really grappling with the question of, can I believe anything? Can I trust myself to discern any truth anywhere? I thought this thing was true my whole life. I believed it literally. I certainly staked my own life on it. I was willing to die for my beliefs and trained my children to be willing to accept martyrdom should it have ever come to that. I bought in 100%, absolutely. And it informed every aspect of my life. It informed how I dressed. what I read, what received my news, what I listened to, just everything. And so then when that filter, if you want to call it, is removed, you're very vulnerable.
Yeah, I think that some of our secular friends or even progressive Christian friends don't maybe appreciate the consuming nature of a fundamentalist faith.
Absolutely. And the losses are multiple. And there are even different types of losses when we lose our faith. It's not just one thing. So there's ambiguous loss is a type of loss that can occur when you don't have a body. Okay, so already it's kind of complicated. You can't say goodbye in that sort of way. There's disenfranchised grief that we deal with, which is grief that's not sanctioned by society. So if you think of maybe someone who was adopted in infancy, they are expected only to be grateful that the family took them in. They're not permitted to grieve the loss of the identity that they would have had. Or say maybe a person had an illicit affair. They've had an affair outside their marriage with another married person. So it's been a secret hush-hush thing. And then that person that they are in love with dies. Well, they can't really grieve that in a public way. Similarly, losing our faith that everything was grounded in, society doesn't understand. They just think, oh, so what? You stopped believing in Santa. I got over it at 8 years old. You can get over it. And that is just so dismissive and completely not understanding the depth of our loss. And I find a lot of people, when they lose their faith, because life just goes on, you have to keep making money. You have to keep supporting your family. And so you don't even have time to examine what the hell just happened. Everything about my life just blew up, but you got to keep going to work. So it's important to understand and start grieving some of those losses. Otherwise, the losses do compound, and then you can get into real trouble down the road.
I do want to get more into the experience, the trauma that people experience from this, but I'd like to just step back for just a quick second.
Sure.
What were the first cracks in the armor for you? What were the first doubts that you had? Was it that discussion about smaller and smaller circles, or was it before that?
It was before that. And I would say something that really got me thinking about how right is this, or how good do I feel about this, had to do with relationships, particularly men and women in the hierarchy of fundamentalism. You've got God is up at the top, and then you got your minister just below that, and then the husband just below him, and then way down at the bottom, you've got the place where women fall or kneel in fundamentalism. And that didn't sit right with me sometimes. I tried to make it sit right. And in fact, that's one reason I started wearing a head covering, because I realized my personality can be fairly exuberant and outgoing, and some people would even say strong. And my husband at the time is a very gentle man, just a quiet-natured, introverted fellow. And so I felt that perhaps the problems in our marriage were more due to my lack of submission. And so as I was reading through the New Testament, of course, I saw, well, women are supposed to wear head coverings, and it's a symbol of their submission to the man. And so I asked his permission. I said, I don't see where we're excused from this. And so if you don't mind. Now, no one that we knew, no one at the whole Bible college, no one we knew wore head coverings. But I was already, because I was a part of homeschool association and we were living in a Bible college town in Canada, my views had already been getting smaller, say. My fundamentalism was getting tighter, wrapping that corset tighter. And so he said, well, if you really feel like you need to do this, and if you can show me evidence where women are supposed to do this and, really support it, then sure, if you feel you need to do it, that's fine. And so I did. And then women in the surrounding towns, so we were living in rural southern Alberta, so lots of farmers and lots of Mennonite groups and Hutterite colonies. And these women would come into town for their groceries, and they started seeing me, not a member of their closed group, wearing a head covering and wearing long skirts and dresses. And I stopped wearing my wedding ring, no makeup, no jewelry, nothing. Like, if you're in for a penny, you're in for a pound. So, and that's part of my personality also. And so I just jumped in that way. And so those women eventually started communicating with me and trying to find out, what's going on with you? Why are you dressing like this? And then they started inviting me out to their closed meetings. And so I would go, and my husband, our little girls, we would all go, and we started worshiping with them on a somewhat regular basis. And it was very interesting because it was a peek into a subculture that most of us don't get to have, because these people were closed off from society. And so I got to see some things that I thought were really neat, and I loved attending church with them. There was no instruments. The men and women sat separately. The singing was quite beautiful. Everything seemed very simple, much simpler and quieter than what we're bombarded with on a regular basis. But I also did see there appeared to be fairly high rates of depression, particularly among the women. And yeah, you are told what you can and cannot do, wear, think, pretty cloistered in that sense. So having grown up in Canada, in a very liberated country, and my parents were religious, but they were not near as fundamentalist as I was. So my growing up, I had more liberties than I ever gave my children. But still, I had much more liberty than these ladies did from the closed fundamentalist Mennonite groups. So I was weighing all that and trying to figure out, how does this work? And so, yeah, there were then difficulties coming along in the marriage. And we had a year or two where just everything fell apart. A family member went to prison for murder, and my parents divorced after 43 years together. And our youngest daughter received a life-threatening diagnosis, and we went bankrupt trying to cover the medical costs. So all these things, bang, bang, bang. I just realized I'd bet on the wrong horse. I felt like I have crossed every T and dotted every I, and there's a shitstorm. Like, I don't dare open my door for fear of the next thing that's going to get flung at me. And it felt so unfair and so terrifying to think, like, is it even possible that everything I've believed has been wrong? And so I started to give myself permission to look into other traditions, other religious, a lot of Eastern type stuff. And the more I did that really was the crack where the light started to come in. And I started to free myself and educate myself. And I just went farther and farther along that road. And here I am today.
Wow. Well, thank you for that very vulnerable description. So several things that you say there really jump out at me. The first of which is something that I noticed, that it is really the people like yourself who take the Bible seriously, who sometimes come to the end having tested it in its thoroughness. Fundamentalism is almost a race to the bottom. Like, who can be the most strict, the most holding back.
The holiest.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, for sure.
And it seems to me, your story is really trying with all of your mind, body, and soul to live that out, and finding that there wasn't enough there. There wasn't anything sustaining you there.
That's exactly the way that it felt. And for me, the way that it was. And so then to have people tell me, well, you just never believed, or you never really understood the Bible or whatever, is so invalidating and shocking to me, because I felt that I had such a beautiful and intimate relationship with my Savior.
Yeah.
That is how I felt. And so in losing that, I lost my cosmic big brother, my sense that someone was watching out for me, and everything was going to be good and fine. Like, as one after another, after these horrible life-altering things kept happening to my family, I saw, no, that is not the case. But I had to kind of take things apart a bit at a time. Like, to rush headlong into nihilism is a recipe for disaster, and that can cause people actually to take their own lives when they go from that one extreme to the other. And I didn't know anybody else who had deconverted. So I felt lonely and afraid. I didn't feel like I could really tell my husband at the time what was going on. We were mostly just struggling to come to terms with what was happening with our daughter and the losses around our marriage unraveling. And certainly to tell people at my church was to just expose myself to their judgment and criticism about, you need to pray harder, and this is just the devil. He's casting slings and arrows at you, and you need to rebuke him and resist him, and have you tried fasting more, and all these things. And by then, of course, I was depressed, was in a depression, and eventually I became suicidal. And thankfully, I recognized the seriousness of my emotional state, and I did reach out to a physician, like an actual medical doctor, told them what was happening. They were very concerned for me, and they helped me immediately put some safeguards in place for my own mental health. And they also started me on some medication, which I needed at the time, just to get me over that hump. And it worked out very well. I'm so grateful I had that help available to me. But that's how serious it was to me to lose my faith.
Loneliness is such a feature of the process because all of the people that you would normally go to are off limits because you know that you're going to just receive judgment from them. Absolutely. And, just encourage the listeners to reach out to find help, that you don't have to go through the process alone.
Oh, yes. And then to have parents and family members and spouses and children who remain entrenched in their religious views. A lot of people feel, at least for a time, it's easier just to pretend. They'll just pretend. They'll just keep going to church and to all the meetings, but their heart is no longer in it. That is also a terrible burden to shoulder. It's really the loss of community that I hear lamented the most strongly, because of course I work with clients who have left religion, and that cry is the loudest, that they truly miss that community because it's a one-stop shop. You get your spiritual needs met. You feel like you're being fed something every week, or you're learning more about the Bible or about this new fantastic Christian book or music or whatever it is. You have all these things going on. And then, of course, if you're a pastor, you also have your livelihood that's tied up in it, and you've spent tens of thousands of dollars on an education specifically to prepare you for that niche. So the loss of community. And when I deconverted, there wasn't the ex-evangelical hashtag there. I don't even think there was Twitter. So I was really kind of flying solo, and it just was a dark, sad place. And then I started making notes about everything that I was reading, trying to piece together my own experience and looking at it then from a psychological point of view as well. And then online, I found Dr. Marlene Winnell, and I saw some of her interviews on CNN and whatever other outlets, and read her book and contacted her. And we developed a relationship and a friendship and a mentorship that endures to this day.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Sure.
There's so many places we could go here, but let's continue on with where you're at here. Dr. Winnell seems to have just a huge, huge influence in this field. Is it correct to say that she coined the term religious trauma?
Yes, religious trauma syndrome, she certainly did. And her book is called Leaving the Fold. I mean, I happen to be an ex-evangelical, but I know that people read that book, people who've come out of Islam, people who've come out of extreme Catholicism, Jehovah's Witness, Mormons, coming out of a fundamentalist religious background. That book is a great starting point to help you understand some of what you've been through and to show you some light at the end of the tunnel, for Pete's sake. I mean, it's the end of your faith, but that does not mean it is the end of your world. It means it's a transition, and beautiful beginnings are often disguised as painful endings, and that's just how it is for us.
So what I'd like as well, let's just pause for a moment and get your definition or Marlene's definition of what is religious trauma, what is religious trauma syndrome, just so that we're all working with the same terms here.
Religious trauma syndrome tends to be what we experience both as a result of being in a confining religious space, and then what we experience when we lose that. when we walk away from that. So I had to give up many things in order to be a member of my faith community. I isolated myself. I put many things off limits to myself, really had to guard my thinking all the time, so it was a lot of cognitive dissonance there. And then when I left that, I lost my community. I lost my sense of purpose. I lost many things as a result of that. So when she talks about religious trauma syndrome, she's kind of encompassing both of those areas.
I've always described, like for me personally, I did almost the same thing that you did of trying to catalog what I was thinking, when I was thinking it, and trying to put things into words. And I identified 3 things that were very specific to the deconversion process. And one of which, the sense of a loss of control. In your faith, if something bad happens or something overwhelming happens, you pray. There's something to do. There's some sense of, I can take this action and that's going to change things for the better. The other is a shame or a guilt for the gullibility. How could I have been so fooled? Especially with hindsight. Hindsight is 2020. And so the things that just look ridiculous today made sense at the time, were completely convincing, and they are not any longer. And then the last one is the one that you've really identified as a huge problem, and that is the loss of community, the loneliness that you feel. You just feel isolated. You feel out there by yourself. And so part of the reason for the podcast, for interacting with people online, is just to say, hey, a lot of people have gone through this. You're not alone out there if you're experiencing doubts right now. And even just what you said, Janice, at the time, there was this sense of you had a deep and profound relationship with God, and you could not imagine a world in which that wouldn't be the case. And I've had Christians say to me, yeah, well, if you had the relationship with God that I have, you wouldn't have deconverted. And it's like, you don't understand. I did have that.
For your listeners, I'm going to tell them I'm rolling my eyeballs right now.
Yes.
I rolled them so hard, I think I saw my brain. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I think for sure your story puts to rest any sense of calling into question the legitimacy of your former faith. And if your story is that you came to the conclusion that these things were not true, then no matter how deep someone is into their fundamentalism, they can begin to see the truth as well.
Yes, I would say in the majority of people I've worked with anyway, that's only the ones I can really talk about, to lose your faith or walk away from your faith when you have been so fully indoctrinated often takes a tragedy. There has to be a tragedy, or in my experience, a series of tragedies, to shake you loose from your cognitive dissonance so that you go from one spot to the other. You can finally, you can be looking in at what you are believing and going, wait a minute, something is not right here. For a lot of people, it takes some kind of tragedy or loss to make them wake up to that. And I think, too, then we can come across as bitter or angry, or lots of ex-theists can just get stuck in a really angry place. Now, anger is a very legitimate part of grief. But we don't want to get stuck, and we can either accept our anger and use it to fuel our change and our growth, or we can just go down in flames with it and light everything else and everybody else on fire, and it's like a horrible conflagration. So that's kind of a point, too, that people need to get to on their own.
Yeah, one of the things that probably my listeners are sick of hearing me say, but it is, again, and I totally agree with you, that anger is a very natural and possibly necessary part of the process, and valid. Valid is the key thing there. But that they're in this moment of, you've done all this research, you've felt all these feelings, you've worked through maybe your own trauma, maybe you have seen a counselor, you've done all of these things and done all the studying. And then when you talk to somebody in your relationship, a friend or a family member, and they're at step 0, and you just light the bridge on fire on your way out in all of that anger and passion. And it's like, some of those relationships probably do need to have the bridge burned, but there are many that you potentially will regret having burned that bridge. And so to be able to calm down just a little and take stock.
Yes. And also, I work with a lot of people who are deconverting while they are married and their partner is not deconverting and has no interest in deconverting. And as you can imagine, this can make for some huge issues in the marriage. And so what I tell my clients is that your liberation from fundamentalist thinking for you is a tremendous gain. To your partner or to your parents, it is the worst possible news that they could receive, and it's throwing their lives out of kilter. So you are grieving losses, but they are also grieving losses. So we need to keep compassion at the forefront. And if we're expressing to our partner or our parents that we no longer believe, we can try to provide them still some comfort by saying, my love for you has not changed. I still love you. I'm still attracted to you. I still am glad that we've created this family unit together. So it's my beliefs have changed, but my love for you has not changed. And I want you to be free to ask me any question about what's happened or why I've come to this conclusion. We can talk about it. I love you. And that kind of makes it possibly smoother, that transition.
Well, you're telling my story.
Oh.
So my wife is very much a believer and an evangelical believer. She is more accepting of people than maybe the typical fundamentalist. But this has been a challenge. This has been a long process for us.
Right.
But that is exactly how I've tried to approach it, to tell her that I love her, I accept her, including her spirituality, including her relationship with God as she understands it.
Nice.
And that I'm not going anywhere, that I want to make the relationship work. And to her credit, she has worked with me on that. And I know that I stuck the knife in and twisted it, right? Like I know how much pain that caused her. And it seems to me like this is an area that is underdeveloped, specifically in the deconversion counseling world. There have to be many of us where you have one believing spouse and a deconverting spouse. And as I had one friend mention recently, there just aren't any resources out there. When you go search this, it's, well, we got divorced, which is bad news, right? That's not what we're looking for. So just...
I smell a book in there for you. I think you should get busy and write that book.
Yeah, exactly.
How to.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It is a big deal.
That's my soapbox. I'm getting off.
Well, that whole element isn't addressed frequently enough, in my opinion, and it really adds to the pain and the confusion that of a time that's already painful and confusing. So it's good to reach out. It's a good time to consult a therapist, and might I add, a secular therapist, because you will have other issues in your marriage that aren't just about religion. So going to someone who doesn't have this particular bent in mind can be helpful, as can looking for things that you still have in common, starting to develop some hobbies aside from religion, but things that you still both feel good about. Volunteering at a homeless shelter, things you can be doing with your children that aren't church related, but that are still wholesome and bring you together as a family and a couple.
Well, my wife is a genius, so she did some research. She has some background in counseling as well. I won't be able to cite the author that she was referring to, but she talked about this idea of having a quote unquote second marriage within the existing marriage, that the rules have reset. And in some ways we were recommitting to one another to say, okay, this is the beginning of the second marriage. It's an interesting analogy, and so far, again, it's working for us. So,
yeah, I have definitely heard that line of thinking used when one partner has had an affair. And so, yes, this is similarly a major transition in the marriage. And some people find they just cannot make it work, and other people, there can be an element of flexibility. Like your partner, it sounds like she's been as flexible as she can be, say. And not everybody is that way, but I'm glad that you have a partner that is that way.
So do I. I am very grateful.
Good choice. You made a good choice back then.
Yes, exactly. So I asked before we got started, if you wouldn't mind if I ask a skeptical question or two. And one of the things that I struggle with, and let me just admit at the beginning that this is probably because I came to this in the late teens, and that was an inoculation in a way. But I have never personally identified with the trauma aspect. I support people who work in this area, and I've had many people on the podcast to talk about it. And yet I always feel like I'm at a distance from it. I guess the part that I'm skeptical about is that trauma isn't a necessary part of the deconversion process. It is a common experience for people, and I don't want to invalidate it in any way. It's a natural experience. But I don't know that it is a required part of the deconversion process. Am I out on a limb there?
Lots of people are happily religious. They feel that their faith adds to their life. They don't feel that in any way they have been traumatized. That does not mean that religion is not traumatizing. Trauma is subjective. And there's a difference between, so if you see a car accident, you see someone get run over by a bus, oh my God, that is pretty freaking traumatizing. Yet it was a one-time experience. So the idea of complex PTSD is more of the trauma is ongoing. The situation is ongoing. You know, growing up in a home where your parents continually tell you from the time you're born that you're a worthless sinner, that you are going to hell. You're 4 years old. You don't even have a concept for what hell is, but your dad yells when he talks about it, and you know it's a terrifying place you don't want to go to. So you spend the next 20 years of your life several times a day praying, begging God, praying the sinner's prayer. Like, you can get very entrenched in that. And then even look at things like the purity movement, purity culture. And now I have people coming to me in their 30s who are no longer religious, who are virgins, who have never even been on a date, and who have been so traumatized by that teaching because they've been told over and over again, your natural sexual inclinations are bad and wrong. You should never even have a thought. A naked woman should be able to walk in front of you and it should not make anything happen for you. It is nuts. And then, so then they've almost had to, they've reverted, some of them, to a place where they the word that they've used to me is that they feel that they are asexual, and that they don't want to be. There are people who are quite happily and healthfully asexual, but I'm talking about people who have had to suppress their natural inclinations towards sexuality for so long, and now they come to me and they say, well, yeah, but I'm still a virgin, and not only that, I have no idea how to even approach the opposite sex. This is a pretty freaking big deal. Sorry, I'm not sure how I got from your question to my rant on purity and against purity culture, but oi, it's a big one.
Agreed, yes. Well, sex is a great topic. Let's talk about that in just a second. I guess what I'm trying to say is to acknowledge the diversity of experiences. And I agree with what you've just described would be incredibly traumatic. It would take a very long time to process through. My personal experience felt like as soon as I admitted to myself that I had doubts, it was just a cascading effect of, well, if this isn't true, is this true? You know, and just looking for, I did the research. Somebody has had to have had an objective fact somewhere. And when I discovered that there weren't any, I was just done. And I mean, it was emotional. It was intense. It was, I don't want to minimize that. I didn't feel like it was traumatic. And I guess that's all I'm trying to say.
Right. I think too, there are, like, the difference between someone who is just kind of, their faith is a comfort, but it doesn't like define their life or rule their life. And then someone like me who was like, okay, I'm ready to die for my faith here. The difference lies in our levels of attachment to an ideology. That's kind of the difference. And that's what makes a fundamentalist or a fanatic. They're kind of brothers there. And I want to recommend an excellent book to your listeners. It's called The 5 Levels of Attachment. And it's by Don Miguel Ruiz Jr. Got to get the junior in there. But that book was super helpful to me in kind of looking back at everything I'd been through and how I got from, say, a level of where my mom is, where she's just kind of happy-go-lucky, just loves everyone. Yep, she loves Jesus too. He's on the list of people that she loves, and she just is so helpful to people and non-judgmental, just a great lady. And then you have my dad, who is very black and white, rigid, fundamentalist, narcissist. And that's another thing too, is that our religion, it gets filtered through the lens of our personality. We can experience our religion through our personality. And so I mentioned before that I really struggle to find the center, and I'm always looking for the center. Inevitably, I get drawn way one way or way the other way. And I see that partly as having grown up in a home with a mentally and emotionally volatile, say, parent. So, yeah, the levels of attachment, and my level of attachment for my religion was like as deep as it could go.
Right. So I've had a few conversations lately with a few people in the counseling world that are trying to make a distinction, and I'm curious what your thoughts on this. Do you make a distinction between religious abuse and religious trauma, or are those kind of one and the same to you?
I certainly think that abuse can lead to trauma. And the conference I'm putting together is looking more at the idea of religious trauma syndrome. Rather than, if you tell people it's about religious trauma, they might immediately go to the place of young boys who have been unfortunately molested by Catholic priests. Like that's kind of a go-to that people have. Or in Canada, we have First Nations people who were shoved into residential schools, which were religious in order. And so they had trauma heaped on them in the name of religion. But we're kind of looking more at the idea of the syndrome of religious trauma and what that encompasses. So the losses you suffered while you were in, and then the losses you suffered when you left. And Marlene is one of our keynote speakers, Dr. Winnell. And so she will be specifically talking about religious trauma syndrome. And then we have other speakers who will be talking about other aspects.
Well, so that's a good segue. Let's talk about the conference for a bit. How did you come up with the idea? It sounds like you have a personal relationship with Dr. Winnell. So how did you get these people? Dr. Daryl Ray is going to be there. Let's talk about it.
Yes. Yeah, very excited to have Dr. Ray joining us. Also, Dr. Valerie Tarico, and I'd love to recommend Dr. Tarico. Her YouTube series is just phenomenal, and she has some books also that are fantastic. Dr. Yanya Lalich, I don't know if you're familiar with that name. She's a cult expert, and she, in the 1970s, was a member of a political cult. But the FBI actually consults Dr. Lalich when they're dealing with groups that are cult groups. So she's fascinating, and she approaches it just in a very interesting way. So she will be speaking about kind of group indoctrination, how that goes. And then Janet Heimlich is also an author and an award-winning journalist, and she has a real passion for children who are harmed in the name of religion. Child maltreatment, yes. So Janet Heimlich will also be joining us. And so by the time I'd attended Dr. Winnell's retreat a couple of times, they were different retreats. And then I've also volunteered at times. And so I would be interacting with people who just you're meeting them at such a vulnerable place, a vulnerable time, and they're talking about their own experiences being in religion and leaving religion and what it cost them. And I thought, I'm sure we represent hundreds of thousands of people, and I want people to know about this. I want people to know there's help when you have left religion. I want therapists to become aware of what a huge issue this is, because again, if you're not raised in religion, it's not even on your radar, you might have clients coming to you and they're presenting with all these different kind of issues, and you don't know that it's their fundamentalist background that helped to create a lot of these issues. So that's when I started thinking, okay, I want to do a conference. Who can I invite? Who might be great? And so I just wrote down a list of the people that I thought were kind of some of the biggest, well-known, respected names in this field. And I wrote them each a letter. They had no idea who I was, but I said, I think that this is such a big issue and I want to do a conference on it. And I would love if you would agree to come and speak. And I thought maybe one of them, maybe two, might say, okay, but all of them answered and said, sign me up. I want to come and be there. And from there, it really morphed into the idea also to provide therapists with tools for helping clients struggling with this, but also it's kind of two-pronged, because I want to provide some help and relief and direction for people who are living with this, but who aren't therapists. So we'll have workshops running consecutively whenever there's not a keynote speaker going on. We'll have 2 different workshops going on. One for therapists and then one for people who are interested public, let's put it that way. So it's getting bigger and bigger. Now I've got Nate Phelps is going to be joining us, and he is, I don't know, do you know who he is? His dad was Fred Phelps from the Westboro Baptist Church, that church in the United States. So Nate abandoned the faith, that aspect of his family quite a while ago, and he's a great speaker. So he'll be joining us. Yasmin Mohammed is an ex-Muslim. She's an activist. She's a great speaker, has a fantastic story, and somewhat controversial. And she will be coming to talk to people who maybe have left the Muslim faith who will be attending. Jeremiah Camara is a filmmaker in the United States, especially focused on how Christianity has affected African Americans. And so he will be super interesting to have. It feels like we're adding speakers every day. At some point, I'm going to have to cut it off and say, we're only like Friday night and all day Saturday and all day Sunday. But I think it might turn into an annual event.
Wow, that's great. So you've answered the big question that I had, which is who is the target audience? And it sounds like it's both therapists and, like you said, just the interested public.
Yes. And on the Saturday night, we've got a couple of professional comedians who also have an interest in the religious trauma, and they will be joining us for a special evening. I've got an artist lined up who she was a member of Unification Church, which was the Moonies. That might have been before your time, I'm not sure, but they were a huge cult, and she has become a well-known artist, and all of her artwork focuses on being in a cult and leaving a cult. And so that's going to be very interesting. I'm hoping to have her artwork, and also a wonderful musician who sings. A lot of her songs are actually about that transition also, from being a very devout Mormon to being a secular person. So we're touching on lots of areas, and we want people to feel welcome. And it's going to be a time of learning. And we'll have some healing circles, some sharing circles going on, opportunities for people to speak into a video camera and briefly share their own story, because it's important to know you're not alone.
Okay. I noticed on the website also there's maybe a specific focus on the experience of minorities, the experience of LGBTQ people, like that these minority groups might have experienced religious trauma in a way that is different than, say, the powerful, the patriarchy, what have you. Yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Ray will also be addressing sexuality in one of his workshops that he's doing. Yes, the LGBTQ plus, we'll just say plus, that community has suffered tremendously because of religious bigotry and intolerance and homophobia. So they are also a group that we want to be reaching out to. And I'm still in contact with various people, potentially as speakers too. So I think it'll be a wonderful time. It's been really interesting putting it all together, that's for sure.
Yeah. I will have links in the show notes for the conference, but just on Mike, when is it and where is it?
April 24th, 25th, and 26th in Vancouver, British Columbia. And your listeners will also receive a discount code. They will get $60 off each ticket. So I'll pass that information along to you. And yeah, so Vancouver, BC, next April 24th to 26th. And it's being held in a hotel in downtown Vancouver. And so they can get a discount also on their room rate.
Very cool. Well, and you can't do any better than Vancouver, BC. That is a gorgeous city. Just absolutely stunning.
Pretty beautiful, I have to say.
Yeah. Janice, before I let you go, I understand that you also do a workshop for leaving fundamentalism. Can you talk about that?
I sure do. Thanks for asking. It's an online workshop. It's called the Divorcing Religion Workshop. And I set it up. It's 7 modules, and 6 of those modules reflect maybe stages that a person goes through when they're going through a marital divorce. So just looking at the different aspects, things that come up. And that was the best way I thought to put together such a workshop. so people can kind of relate to it. Even if you haven't been divorced, there's a good chance you have been through a heartbreak of some kind, and you can recognize some of these stages. And then the 7th module is all about how we fell into fundamentalism in the first place and how we can avoid it in the future. So it's an online workshop. I email out one module per week, and then we have 2-hour session where we do a video conference call on Zoom, and everybody talks about their own experience and what they thought, what they got from the module. So right now it goes out over 7 weeks. We meet on Sunday mornings at 10 o'clock, but I am also looking at formatting it into just a weekend, Saturday and Sunday. Do it that way.
Without giving away the secret sauce there, give the people some hope. What are some steps that people should take when they have crossed this Rubicon? What are the things they need to be looking for and doing?
Sure. One of the first things I recommend is reading Marlene's book, Leaving the Fold. That can help you kind of ground yourself and get onto something that feels solid, get some understanding. Then I would say you need to start reaching out and trying to rebuild your community. So on Twitter, I have found the ex-evangelical hashtag just helpful for me to identify other people. I've also joined a number of humanist groups and atheist groups, both on Facebook and Twitter. That's been helpful for me. And then I also wanted some real life meetings. So I started looking at meetups in my town and different groups. And we have a humanist group that meets once a month here. And so I'm applied to sit on the board of that group. And they do some volunteer work in the community. And they also just talk about really interesting things. And then in America, I think Sunday Assembly is kind of popular. I don't know that we have them in Canada. But again, it's the idea of you're building your community. And now it's going to be like a patchwork quilt. It's not a one-stop shop anymore. Unfortunately, you do have to do the legwork. You're going to have to do some research and start building those communities yourself. And definitely educate yourself. There is no shortage of videos and excellent books and even some TV shows on Netflix to learn about what you've been through. And also you're going to have gaps in your education if you grew up very fundamentalist. My science gaps were huge. A lot of people, as I mentioned, there's gaps related to their sexuality and things that they don't know. So embrace it as an exciting opportunity. You're rebuilding yourself. And you get to be the person that you want to be.
That is exceptionally well said. Janice, if people want to get in touch with you, how can they do that?
They can write to me if they want information about the conference, Janice@court2020.com, and CORT is CORT, Conference on Religious Trauma.
Okay.
They can also write to me, freedom@divorcingreligion.com. That's about my workshop. They can find me on Twitter. I'm @divorcereligion. And on Twitter, I'm also @wise_counselor. And counselor, of course, has 2 L's because I am Canadian. So those are just some different ways people can reach out to me. And I'd love to hear from any of your listeners. And as I said, I'll get you that discount code for the conference.
That sounds great. And I will share that. So.
Okay.
Janice, thank you for your time. I appreciate you being on the podcast.
It was such a joy. Thank you, David.
Final thoughts on the episode. I was unaware of Janice's story, and I think that was the most compelling part of this conversation. The depths of the fundamentalism, even choosing to wear a head covering when the people around her, that wasn't a thing. As we mentioned, that fundamentalism can be a race to the bottom, who can be the most set apart, the most holy, in Janice's words. And Janice proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that she gave it everything she had. As deconverts, and those of us deconstructing, often have to defend our former faith. And of all the people I've interviewed, I think Janice wins that battle more than anyone else. She gave it everything she had. And yet Janice is one of those people who came to the conclusion that it just isn't true. I thought Janice's perspective was interesting when she said that it might take a tragedy, or more than one tragedy, to shake you loose from your cognitive dissonance. Again, I think there's a diversity of experiences, and it's important to hear from each of those. And for Janice, it was a number of things going wrong all at the same time that tragically allowed her to see the truth. The conference Janice is conducting is the Conference on Religious Trauma in Vancouver, BC, April 24th to the 26th. There is an array of interesting speakers there: Dr. Marlene Monell, Dr. Daryl Ray, Dr. Yanya Lalich, Dr. Valerie Tirico, a number of other people. I'd be here all day if I listed them all. Please check out the website, cort2020.com, CORT2020.com. And again, Janice has provided a discount code, GA036, that is capital G, capital A, 036, a $60 off code for registration. Please take her up on that offer. It sounds like it's going to be quite the party, including comedians and speakers of all kinds, and the target audience is both mental health professionals and the interested public. So if you've experienced religious trauma yourself, this is something you might want to look into. Again, this being the U.S. holiday, Thanksgiving, and I know the difficulty that many of you are facing of going home, being around fundamentalist family that might not be affirming of who you are as a person, or the deconstruction process that you're going through, the deconversion process. Just want you to remember that you are not alone. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of us, as Janice said, hundreds of thousands represented. And we are our chosen family. We choose to be family together. Be thankful for the online communities that you have. Be thankful for the people who support you, the people who recognize you for who you are. That is your secular grace thought for Thanksgiving. I'll let you know here that I plan on releasing a very powerful and important episode in the middle of December, and then I'll be taking a brief break, coming back in relatively early January. The episode in December will continue some of what Janice and I spoke about here about being unequally yoked. I have the privilege of doing an interview with the wife of a non-believer. She is very much a believer, and her story is a compelling one and an important one for us to hear. Thanks again to John at Glen Coyote Studios in Fort Collins for help with production and editing of this podcast. Time for some footnotes. The song is a track called Waves by Makaih Beats. Please check out her music. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to help support the podcast, here are the ways you can go about that. First, help promote it. The podcast audience grows by word of mouth. If you found it useful or just entertaining, please pass it on to your friends and family. Post about it on social media so that others can find it. Please rate and review the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. This will help raise the visibility of our show. Join me on the podcast. Tell your story. Have you gone through a faith transition? You want to tell that to the world? Let me know and let's have you on. Do you know someone who needs to tell their story? Let them know. Do you have criticisms about atheism or humanism, but you're willing to have an honesty contest with me? Come on the show. If you have a book or a blog that you want to promote, I'd like to hear from you. Also, you can contribute technical support. If you are good at graphic design, sound engineering, or marketing, please let me know and I'll let you know how you can participate. And finally, financial support. There will be a link on the show notes to allow contributions which would help defray the cost of producing the show. If you want to get in touch with me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, or you can send email to gracefulatheist@gmail.com. You can tweet at me at gracefulatheist, or you can just check out my website at gracefulatheist.wordpress.com. Get in touch and let me know if you appreciate the podcast. Well, this has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Grab somebody you love and tell them how much they mean to you. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.